The grand ballroom was glowing with golden lights, filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and soft background music. The richest and most powerful people in the city had gathered for the billionaire's charity event. Everything looked perfect: crystal chandeliers above, polished marble floors below, and a shining black grand piano sitting proudly in the center of the room like a treasure. The billionaire, known for his wealth and ego, stood near the piano with a glass of champagne in his hand. He loved being the center of attention, and the crowd loved watching him. He had already made several jokes about how no one in the room could ever compete with him in talent or money. People laughed, not because the jokes were funny, but because they wanted to stay on his good side. As the music quieted down, the billionaire tapped the piano gently with his hand. "This," he said loudly, so everyone could hear, "is not just a piano. It is the finest instrument money can buy. And do you know what? If someone here can play it better than me, I will marry them." The room burst into laughter. The statement was so bold, so ridiculous, that people thought he was joking. Women in elegant gowns laughed behind their jeweled hands. Men in tuxedos exchanged amused looks. Someone shouted, "Be careful. You might end up with a surprise bride tonight." The billionaire laughed too, enjoying the attention. No one truly believed anyone would step forward. After all, who would dare to challenge him? The guests were mostly business partners, socialites, and politicians. Music wasn't their world. They came for the food, the connections, and the chance to stand close to power. To them, the challenge was nothing more than entertainment. But in the corner of the hall, standing quietly with a mop in his hand, was Marcus the janitor. He had been cleaning unnoticed, blending into the background as the rich chatted and laughed. When he heard the billionaire's words, his eyes slowly drifted toward the piano. His heart began to beat faster. For Marcus, the piano was not just an instrument. It was a dream, a secret love he had carried his whole life. The crowd's laughter continued. "Imagine a janitor playing this piano." One guest whispered mockingly to another, not even realizing Marcus could hear them. Another chuckled, "Only trained artists can touch an instrument like this. Certainly not someone who polishes floors." Their words cut through the air, but Marcus stayed silent. His gaze fixed on the piano as though it were calling his name. Meanwhile, the billionaire sat down at the piano bench with great confidence. He played a lively tune, loud and showy, more to impress than to inspire. The crowd clapped and cheered, though few were truly moved by the music. For them, it was not about the sound. It was about watching wealth put on a performance. When he finished, he stood proudly and looked around the hall, daring someone to step forward. "See," he said smugly. "Who here can do better? Remember, the offer stands: play better than me, and I'll marry you." The guests laughed again, shaking their heads. No one dared. To challenge him would be to risk humiliation, and no one wanted to be the fool in front of such a powerful man. The room seemed united in silence, except for Marcus, who felt something stirring deep inside him. He remembered the nights he had spent alone in an old church, practicing on a broken piano. He remembered how music had been his escape from hardship, his secret gift when the world gave him nothing. And now, standing in the shadows of a glamorous ballroom, he realized he might never get a chance like this again. But doubt pulled at him. He was just a janitor. To everyone in that room, he was invisible, unworthy of attention. If he failed, he would not just embarrass himself, he would confirm every cruel whisper, every mocking laugh. Yet, if he succeeded, he could silence them. All the challenge had been spoken like a careless joke by a man full of pride. But to Marcus, it was more than a joke. It was a door-opening test of courage, chance to show the world the fire he had carried quietly in his heart for so long. The piano stood there, shining under the golden lights, waiting. The crowd still buzzed with laughter and chatter. never imagining that the true challenge had been heard by someone they had all overlooked. Marcus gripped the handle of his mop a little tighter, his heart pounding as he looked once more at the billionaire's smug smile. He did not know yet what he would do, but one thing was certain: the night was about to change forever. The billionaire's boast still lingered in the air. And the guests continued to laugh, sipping their drinks, and exchanging amused whispers. To them, the whole piano challenge was nothing more than a joke, a way for the billionaire to show off his wealth and confidence. But not everyone was laughing. Marcus, the janitor, was standing near the edge of the room with his cleaning cart. He had been sweeping the floor quietly, invisible to the glamorous crowd when the challenge was made. His eyes had drifted toward the shining black piano, and something inside him stirred. Music was not foreign to him. It was part of his soul, hidden away from the world. But here, in this dazzling ballroom, he was not seen as a man with a soul. He was just the janitor. As Marcus lingered, a group of well-dressed guests noticed his gaze fixed on the piano. One of them, a tall man with slicked-back hair and a cruel smile, leaned toward his companion and said in a mocking voice, "Look at him. Do you see that? The janitor thinks he can play." His companion chuckled, glancing at Marcus as if he were a child staring at candy behind a glass window. Another woman in an elegant gown whispered just loudly enough for Marcus to hear, "Imagine him sitting at that piano. His dirty hands on those ivory keys. What a joke." Her friends laughed softly, their laughter sharp as knives. Marcus's face warmed with embarrassment. He lowered his eyes, pretending to busy himself with his mop. He had been laughed at before mocked. For his job, dismissed for his appearance, judged for his skin color. But somehow, in this golden room, surrounded by wealth and arrogance, the sting felt sharper. The laughter wasn't just about him, it was about people like him. People who worked hard in silence, but were never truly seen. The ridicule spread like wildfire. More guests noticed Marcus's lingering presence near the piano. Someone called out jokingly, "Hey janitor, why don't you give us a tune? The billionaire might make you his bride." Laughter roared through the crowd again, cruel and careless. Marcus tried to step back, but his cheeks burned as dozens of eyes fell on him, seeing him not as a man, but as a source of amusement. The billionaire himself noticed the commotion and smirked. He raised his glass and, with his booming voice, added fuel to the fire. "Ah, yes, the janitor? Do you play, my friend?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. "Come, entertain us. Or are you just here to polish the floor?" The crowd erupted again. Every laugh echoed like a slap across Marcus's face. Inside, his chest tightened with anger, but he swallowed it down. This wasn't new. Life had been full of moments where people dismissed him before giving him a chance. Yet tonight, something about their laughter cut deeper, perhaps because of the piano sitting right there, so close to him, so out of reach. Marcus thought back to his childhood, to the nights when his mother worked double shifts and he sat alone in the church basement, teaching himself to play on a broken piano with missing keys. He remembered the hours of practice, the music that poured out of him when no one was there to laugh. He had played not for fame or money, but because music was his freedom. And now, watching these people mock him, he wondered why his gift should remain hidden any longer. Still, doubt gripped him. What if he tried and failed? What if his hands shook from nerves and the sound came out wrong? He imagined their laughter growing louder, the billionaire's smug smile widening. They would not only laugh at his failure, they would use it as proof that he had no right to even try. A voice inside him whispered, "Stay quiet. Let them laugh. You will never belong in their world." But another voice, stronger and fiercer, rose up from within. Show them who you are. You have nothing to lose, but everything to prove. The ridicule continued, cruel comments falling. Like rain, he probably doesn't even know which end of the piano to sit at. Maybe he'll mop the keys instead of playing them. What a funny little show this would be. Marcus gripped the mop handle tighter, his knuckles white. Each word, each laugh, pushed him closer to a decision. He could stay in the shadows forever. Or he could step into the light heaven if it meant risking failure. The piano sat only a few steps away, gleaming under the chandelier. It seemed almost alive, waiting for someone who could truly understand. The billionaire had played it, yes, but only for show, for pride. Marcus knew he could make it sing with truth. He could pour his soul into its keys and silence the room. But courage is never easy. Marcus stood there, torn between fear and destiny, as the ridicule surrounded him like a storm. He could feel the crowd's eyes burning into him, daring him to try, expecting him to fail. And yet, beneath all the laughter and mockery, something else was rising, a fire that could no longer be hidden. The challenge had been made. The ridicule had been thrown at him like stones. And Marcus knew, deep down, that the only way to stop their laughter was to show them what real music, real genius, sounded like. The night was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Marcus stayed silent as the laughter died down, but inside him, old memories began to stir. The crowd saw only a janitor, a man with rough hands and a faded uniform. But they didn't know his story. They didn't know the passion that had burned in him since he was a child, a passion that had been hidden, buried under years of hardship, yet never extinguished. When Marcus was just a boy, he lived in a small neighborhood where money was scarce, but dreams were endless. His mother worked long hours as a cleaner in offices, sometimes leaving before dawn and returning long after dark. She had little to give him except her love and wisdom. "Son," she used to say, "life will try to put you in a box. But your gift, whatever it is, can take you beyond that box. Never let anyone tell you that you're less." One evening, when Marcus was around 10 years old, he wandered into a local church. It was quiet, the pews empty, but in one corner stood an old, slightly broken upright piano. Its wood was scratched, and several of the keys were chipped, but to Marcus, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He sat down, hesitantly pressing one key, then another. The sound was imperfect, but magical. In that moment, something inside him awakened. He didn't know how to read music, but his ears and his heart guided him. Slowly, he taught himself how to play, returning to the church whenever he could. The janitor there, an elderly man with kind eyes, noticed Marcus's curiosity and allowed him to stay after hours. Night after night, Marcus would play in the dim light, losing himself in melodies that came from his soul. The church became his sanctuary, the piano his closest friend. Whenever life grew heavy, when there wasn't enough food on the table, when kids at school mocked him for his worn clothes, when he watched his mother cry from exhaustion, he poured all his emotions into those keys. Years passed, and Marcus grew better and better. He listened to music on old tapes, memorizing rhythms and harmonies, then recreating them by ear. He learned how to blend sorrow with joy, silence with thunder. The piano became not just an instrument, but his voice, his way of expressing what words never could. But life was unforgiving. College was not an option, too expensive. Music schools never returned his letters. Survival came first. So Marcus took whatever jobs he could find, sweeping floors, carrying boxes, fixing leaks. The dream of becoming a musician began to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of bills and responsibilities. Yet still, late at night, whenever he found a piano, whether in a church, a community center, or even in abandoned buildings, he would sit down and play. His fingers never forgot. His soul never stopped singing. Now, standing in the Billionaire's ballroom, surrounded by silk dresses and expensive suits. Marcus felt that same burning passion he had as a child in the church. The difference was that here, people mocked him for even daring to glance at the piano. They couldn't see past the mop in his hand or the uniform on his back. They didn't know that music had been his secret companion for decades, shaping him, strengthening him. As the crowd laughed, Marcus remembered one night long ago when he had nearly given up. He had been working late, exhausted, and passed by the church. Inside, the piano was still there, waiting. He sat down, telling himself it would be the last time he played. But when his fingers touched the keys, something powerful happened. The music poured out of him like a river, filling the empty church with beauty. When he finished, he noticed a small group of people standing silently at the doorway, listening with tears in their eyes. They had felt his passion, even though he was nobody to the world. That night, he realized something important. Music wasn't about fame, money, or recognition. It was about truth. It was about reaching people's hearts. And even if the world never gave him a stage, he would never stop playing. The ballroom lights glittered, the billionaire smirked, and the guests whispered cruel words. But Marcus wasn't just a janitor staring at a piano. He was a man with years of hidden passion, a man whose soul was tied to the keys. They didn't know it, but the laughter in that room had awoken something inside him. The piano wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a doorway. A doorway back to the boy in the church, to the music that had saved him countless times. His passion, though buried, was alive. And soon it would erupt in front of everyone who doubted him. For now, Marcus stayed still, his mop in hand, his eyes on the piano. But deep in his heart, he knew that the time to reveal his hidden passion was coming. The ridicule had hurt, yes, but it had also lit the flame brighter. And when he finally stepped forward, the world would never laugh at him again. The room was alive with chatter and laughter. Yet to Marcus, it felt strangely quiet. His ears buzzed, not from the sound of the crowd, but from the pounding of his own heartbeat. He stood there with the mop still in his hand, staring at the piano as if it were calling his name. Every second that passed felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on him, urging him to either step forward or forever hold his silence. The billionaire had returned to his seat, basking in the admiration of the guests after his showy performance. He leaned back smugly, tapping the rim of his champagne glass with one finger. "Well then," he said loudly, scanning the room. "It looks like no one dares to try. I suppose my offer is safe." His words sent another ripple of laughter through the crowd. Marcus's chest tightened. A war was raging inside him. One part of him screamed to stay where he was, to keep his head down and avoid becoming their entertainment. That voice reminded him of the countless times he had been told he wasn't good enough, that he should know his place, that men like him belonged in the background. But another voice, stronger and fiercer, rose from deep within. "This is your moment. You've hidden long enough. You've played in empty churches, in the dark, in silence. Now let the world hear you. Show them who you are." His hands trembled slightly as he placed the mop against the wall. The sound of it, leaning on the marble floor, was faint. Yet in Marcus's ears, it was deafening, a signal that he had made his choice. Slowly, almost cautiously, he began to walk forward. Each step felt like walking into fire, because with every step, the laughter grew louder. "Look, he's going for it," someone shouted, barely containing their amusement. "Oh, this will be rich," another added, their words dripping with mockery. A few guests clapped sarcastically, as if they were about to watch a comedy act. The billionaire himself smirked, folding his arms across his chest, clearly entertained by the thought of a janitor humiliating himself on his precious piano. Marcus's heart thundered. But he kept moving, his eyes fixed on the black grand piano. The polished surface reflected the golden light of the chandeliers, making it look almost unreal, like a dream placed in the middle of the ballroom. For years, he had stood in the shadows of such instruments, never allowed to touch, always watching from afar. And now, for the first time, it was within his reach. As he arrived at the piano, he hesitated for a brief moment. His reflection stared back at him from its glossy surface. A man in a simple uniform, hands roughened from work, shoulders heavy with years of labor. Around him, the crowd murmured with expectation, waiting for him to fail. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. This isn't about them. This isn't about the billionaire or his joke. This is about you, about the boy in the church who fell. In love with music, about the years of silent practice, about your mother's words. With that thought, Marcus gently pulled the piano bench and sat down. The room quieted slightly, curiosity replacing laughter. Some leaned forward, eager to watch him make a fool of himself. Others whispered, placing bets in hushed tones on how long he'd last before giving up. Marcus placed his hands above the keys but didn't press them yet. Instead, he let them hover for a moment, as if feeling the weight of the moment through the tips of his fingers. He could almost hear his heart playing the first notes before his hands even moved. Behind him, someone coughed impatiently. "Any day now," a voice muttered. The crowd chuckled again, and then, with steady hands, Marcus pressed the first key. The note rang out clear and sharp, filling the air with a sound so pure that the room instantly hushed. There was something different in the way he touched the piano, something tender, precise, and full of emotion. He played a second note, then a third, building a melody that carried not arrogance but truth. The laughter stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes locked on Marcus. His fingers moved gracefully. No hesitation, no clumsiness. It was as if the piano had been waiting for him all along. The billionaire's smirk slowly faded. He leaned forward, his glass of champagne forgotten in his hand. The guests, who just moments ago had mocked, now sat in stunned silence. Marcus didn't notice their stares anymore. He was somewhere else, back in the church, back in his youth, back in the quiet nights when music was his only friend. The ballroom, the wealthy guests, the billionaire, they had disappeared. All that remained was him, the piano, and the story. He was telling through music. Each note carried the weight of his struggles, the beauty of his dreams, the pain of his ridicule, and the fire of his hidden passion. The courage he had finally found wasn't just in walking forward. It was in daring to let them hear his soul. And for the first time that evening, the ballroom was completely silent, not from mockery, not from arrogance, but from awe. Marcus had stepped into the fire of ridicule, and with courage, he was about to turn it into light. The first note Marcus played seemed to float in the air longer than it should have. Like time itself had slowed down to listen. It wasn't loud or forceful, but it carried something deeper, something pure. The golden ballroom, once filled with laughter and cruel whispers, grew strangely quiet. People who had been sipping wine, laughing at jokes, or chatting idly suddenly turned their heads. The sound was different, unexpected. Marcus pressed a second note, then a third. And together, they formed a delicate beginning, like the opening of a story that begged to be heard. His hands trembled for a split second, but as soon as the melody began to take shape, his fear melted away. His fingers seemed to remember a path they had walked countless times before in the dim glow of a church basement. The guests exchanged uncertain glances. Some smirked at first, thinking it was a lucky start. But as Marcus continued, their expressions shifted. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. His touch was confident, his rhythm steady. The janitor they expected to stumble and embarrass himself was instead weaving something extraordinary. Marcus's eyes were half closed. his mind far from the glittering chandeliers and mocking eyes. He wasn't playing for them. He wasn't even playing for the billionaire. He was playing for himself. For the boy who had once dreamed of this moment. The music pouring out of him was raw and honest, carried the weight of years of silence, of nights spent practicing alone, of pain and hope living side by side. The melody grew richer, fuller, as his left hand joined his right, building harmonies that filled the room. The grand piano responded to his touch as though it had been waiting for him all its life. Each note resonated, bouncing off the marble floors and golden walls, wrapping the audience in a sound that was both tender and powerful. People stopped breathing for a moment. A woman in a red gown, who had laughed the loudest earlier, now sat frozen, her lips slightly parted in disbelief. A man who had whispered mockery to his companion clenched his glass tighter, embarrassed by how wrong he had been. Slowly, conversations died, and one by one, the mocking smiles disappeared. The billionaire leaned forward in his chair, narrowing his eyes. He had expected a disaster, something to laugh at, a way to prove once more that he stood above men like Marcus. But what he was hearing was different. This was not the sound of someone fumbling with keys. This was the sound of mastery. Marcus's music carried the weight of his struggles. With every rising note, he expressed the pain of being overlooked. With every falling chord, he expressed the quiet dignity of a man who never gave up. His fingers danced across the keys, sometimes soft and whisper-like, other times thunderous and commanding. The contrast created a spellbinding effect, pulling every heart in the room into his story. He remembered nights when his stomach growled with hunger, but he still played. He remembered the tired face of his mother, who never got to hear him perform. On a real stage, all of those memories flowed through his fingers, spilling into the music. The piano became his voice, and the room became his audience. Whether they wanted it or not, a hush swept through the hall, so heavy it was almost sacred. Even the waiters had stopped moving, holding trays frozen in their hands. The chandeliers above seemed to shimmer in rhythm with the melody. Marcus wasn't simply playing the piano. He was commanding the room, reshaping the atmosphere with every note. And for Marcus, this wasn't performance. This was confession. Every sound he created was a truth he had hidden. Every phrase of music a piece of his soul he had locked away. He wasn't just playing. He was telling his life story without saying a word. Somewhere in the middle of the song, as the music swelled, Marcus lifted his head slightly and opened his eyes. He saw then the same people who had mocked him just minutes ago, sitting utterly still, their eyes wide, their mouths silent. And for the first time in his life, Marcus felt something he had always longed for: respect. Not because of money, not because of titles, but because of his gift. He pressed into the final passage of the piece, his hands moving faster, the sound rising higher and higher, filling every corner of the grand room. It was no longer just music, was victory. It was defiance against every insult, every laugh, every moment of being dismissed. It was his declaration that genius could live anywhere, even in the hands of a janitor. When the last note, finally, rang out, it lingered in the air, echoing in the silence that followed. Marcus's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. His hands, though steady, trembled slightly from the release of everything he had carried inside. The ballroom was silent. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the clink of a glass. Dozens of eyes stared at him, stunned, as if they had just witnessed something beyond explanation. Marcus sat quietly at the piano, his head bowed, not seeking applause or recognition, but simply allowing the moment to exist. For him, the first notes had already told the story, his story, and no laughter in the world could ever erase what he had just shown them. The final note of Marcus's playing still hung in the air like a ghost. shimmering in the golden light of the chandeliers. For a few seconds, the grand ballroom was utterly silent. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. It was as if the world itself had frozen, captured in the magic of what had just happened. Marcus slowly lifted his hands from the keys, letting them rest gently in his lap. His chest rose and fell as he caught his breath, but his eyes remained lowered. He didn't smile. He didn't look around to search for approval. He simply sat there in quiet dignity, a man who had just laid bare his soul for the world to hear. The crowd, however, was not quiet because they were unimpressed. It was because they were stunned. The same mouths that had laughed at him moments earlier were now frozen in disbelief. The same eyes that had rolled with mockery now stared at him wide and unblinking. The janitor, the man they had dismissed as invisible, had just revealed himself to be a master. The woman in the red gown who had mocked his dirty hands felt her cheeks flush with shame. She lowered her eyes to her lap, unable to meet Marcus's calm, steady presence at the piano. The tall man with slicked back hair, who had laughed the loudest, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his smirk long gone. He fidgeted with his tie, as though the silence itself was pressing down on him like a weight. Whispers began to ripple softly through the crowd, but they were not mocking anymore. They were words of disbelief. "Did you see his hands?" Someone murmured. "That wasn't just playing. That was genius," another whispered. "How could a janitor?" A third voice began, but the sentence trailed off, swallowed by the awe of the moment. The billionaire who had started this entire spectacle sat in stunned silence as well. His smirk had faded completely. His champagne glass, once held confidently, now rested forgotten on the table beside him. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at Marcus as though trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. For the first time that evening, his arrogance slipped away, replaced by something unfamiliar: respect, mixed with unease. Marcus slowly lifted his head. His eyes swept the room, not with pride or defiance, but with quiet strength. He had no need to speak. The music had already spoken for him. He saw their faces, pale with shame, wide with awe, lips pressed tightly as if afraid to say the wrong thing now. For years, he had been invisible to people like them, yet in the span of a single song, he had commanded their entire world. The silence stretched on, heavy and almost unbearable. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, like someone testing whether it was safe to break the spell. But then another clap joined, and another, until the ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. The sound filled the room, louder than the laughter had ever been, shaking the air with its force. Guests stood to their feet, clapping furiously, their eyes shining with admiration. The same people who had mocked Marcus now looked at him as though he were a legend. But Marcus didn't bask in their applause. He simply bowed his head slightly, acknowledging them with humility, then rested his hands once more on the keys, as if to remind himself that the piano, not the people, was his true audience. For many in that room, the applause wasn't just for the music. It was a release of guilt, a desperate attempt to erase the cruelty they had shown earlier, or their shame clung to them. And clapping was the only way they could express both awe and regret. The billionaire finally stood, his eyes locked on Marcus. His lips pressed together in a thin line, and though he clapped along with the crowd, there was no joy in his face. It was a look of a man forced to swallow his pride, a man who realized he had been outshone in front of everyone he had sought to impress. Yet beneath his unease, there was something else, a flicker of respect, because deep down, even he could not deny what he had witnessed. Marcus wasn't just good, he wasn't just talented. He was extraordinary. As the applause roared on, Marcus remained calm. He didn't smile or wave like a performer hungry for attention. He didn't boast or gloat. He sat with the quiet dignity of a man who knew the truth. Greatness does not need validation. It simply exists, whether people recognize it or not. And that, more than anything else, was what stunned the crowd the most. This janitor, this man they had ridiculed, wasn't basking in their sudden admiration. He didn't need it. His music had already proved what words never could. That genius lives where no one expects it. And true talent cannot be hidden forever. The awe in the room hung heavy, mixed with shame, mixed with wonder. For the first time, the guests saw Marcus not as a janitor, not as a background shadow, but as a man who had risen above them, all without ever leaving his seat at the piano. And, though they clapped and cheered, inside, many of them knew the truth. They had laughed at greatness before it revealed itself. And that realization would haunt them long after the music was gone. The applause rumbled through the ballroom like thunder. But Marcus remained still, his hands folded gently in his lap. He wasn't playing for claps, cheers, or standing ovations. His music had been for something much deeper, for his mother's memory. For the boy he once was, for the countless nights when no one listened. Yet, the roaring sound of admiration around him felt strange. Just minutes ago, these very people had laughed at him. Now, their eyes gleamed with awe. Their voices cried his praise. Slowly, the clapping faded, replaced by a hum of whispers. Everyone wanted to speak to their neighbor, to put into words what they had just witnessed. But most of them couldn't. How could they explain the way a janitor had silenced an entire room with nothing but music? The billionaire finally rose from his chair. His tall frame straightened, his face tight with emotions he didn't want to reveal. All eyes turned toward him, waiting for his reaction. After all, it had been his careless challenge, his mocking joke that had led to this moment. He cleared his throat, his voice echoing across the quiet room. "Well," he began, his tone struggling between pride and discomfort, "it seems we have underestimated our friend here." He gestured stiffly toward Marcus, as if the words themselves cost him something. "I admit, I did not expect such skill. Perhaps I was too quick to joke." The crowd chuckled nervously. Some glanced at Marcus with apologetic smiles, trying to wash away their earlier cruelty. But Marcus only sat calmly, his eyes steady, his dignity untouched. He did not need their pity, nor their sudden shift of favor. The billionaire hesitated. Then, as if remembering his own boast, he let out a forced laugh. "And, of course, I did say that if someone could play this piano better than me, I would marry them." His words brought a ripple of laughter, but it wasn't the same carefree laughter as before. This time, it was uneasy, awkward, because everyone in the room knew the truth. Marcus had outplayed him. The joke wasn't funny any more, it was real. All eyes shifted between the billionaire and Marcus, waiting to see what would happen. Some expected Marcus to stand proudly, to demand the billionaire keep his word. Others thought he might laugh it off, proving he was gracious even in victory. But Marcus did neither. He rose slowly from the bench, his tall frame steady and unhurried. He turned to face the crowd, not with arrogance, but with quiet strength. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and clear. "I don't need marriage," Ku said, his gaze moving briefly to the billionaire, then to the room. "I don't need applause, Ka. I just need respect. That's all I've ever wanted, not for my job, not for my clothes, not for where I come from, but for the gift I've carried all my life." The room was still, his words heavier than any music. A few guests bowed their heads in shame, remembering their cruel laughter. Others felt a pang of guilt burn in their chests. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just a janitor who had played the piano. He was a teacher, reminding them of something they had forgotten. That dignity belongs to everyone. no matter their place in life. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably, his pride clearly wounded. Yet even he couldn't deny the truth. Slowly, and with visible effort, he nodded. "You are right," he admitted, his voice low. "You've earned more than respect tonight. You've earned recognition." The crowd erupted in applause again, but this time it wasn't out of guilt or surprise. It was genuine. They weren't clapping because they felt sorry for Marcus. They were clapping because they had witnessed greatness and had no choice but to honor it. News of the performance spread quickly beyond the ballroom. Journalists who had been invited to the charity event wrote feverishly about the janitor genius who had silenced the wealthy elite with a piano. By the next morning, headlines carried his story. Hidden talent stuns billionaire gala, and janitor plays like a prodigy. For Marcus's recognition didn't come in the form of money or fame. Not at first. It came in the faces of strangers who now looked at him differently, with admiration instead of dismissal. It came in the invitations from music teachers, concert halls, and universities who reached out, offering him opportunities he had once been denied. But perhaps the most important recognition was something quieter, something invisible. It was the shift inside the hearts of the people who had mocked him that night. They would never forget how wrong they had been. They would never again look at a man in a uniform and assume they knew his worth. As Marcus stepped away from the piano that night, he carried nothing in his hands, no trophy, no contract, no riches. But in his heart, he carried something far greater. He had shown the world his truth. He had turned ridicule into reverence, silence into song, invisibility into recognition. And though the applause eventually faded, the memory of that night would never die. For Marcus, it wasn't about proving himself to the billionaire or the crowd. It was about proving, once and for all, that true genius doesn't need permission to shine it, only needs courage. The night in the billionaire's ballroom ended, but its echo lived on. Long after the guests went home, long after the chandeliers dimmed and the tables were cleared, people could still feel the weight of what they had witnessed. It wasn't just a performance. It was a revelation. A janitor, once invisible in the corner, had risen and shown the world a side of himself no one expected. By the next morning, Marcus's story had spread like wildfire. Newspapers ran headlines. The janitor who played like a genius, talent, knows no status, and music that silenced the rich. Clips from the gala began to circulate, shaky recordings made by guests who couldn't resist capturing the unbelievable moment. On social media, strangers who had never met Marcus shared his name with awe, calling him an inspiration, a symbol of hidden greatness. But while the world outside buzzed with fascination, Marcus himself remained humble. He returned to work the next day, pushing his mop down familiar hallways. His coworkers stared at him with wide eyes, whispering his name as though they were meeting him for the first time. Some clapped him on the back. Others asked if the rumors were true. Marcus only smiled gently and said, "I just played." Yet life could never return to the way it was. Invitations began to arrive, letters, phone calls, even visits from people who had once ignored him. A local music school offered him a position as a guest instructor. A concert hall asked if he would perform. Small record company offered to record his music. Doors that had always been shut now swung open. And Marcus found himself standing at the threshold of opportunities he had once only dreamed about. Still, what mattered most to him wasn't the fame or the recognition. It was the chance to use his gift to inspire others. He began to visit schools in poor neighborhoods, playing for children who, like him, thought their dreams were too far away. He told them, "Don't let anyone laugh you out of your own talent." They laughed at me too. But laughter can't stop the truth. And the children listened. They saw in Marcus someone who looked like them. Someone who had struggled like them, yet someone who had broken through the barriers of ridicule and doubt. To them, he wasn't just a musician. He was proof that they, too, could rise. The billionaire, too, could not escape the shadow of that night. He had meant his words as a joke, a display of arrogance. But now, those words followed him wherever he went. People asked him, "What did you think when the janitor outplayed you?" His pride suffered, but deep down, he knew the truth. Marcus had shown him a lesson money could never buy. Though he never admitted it publicly, in private he carried a quiet respect for the man he had once mocked. As time passed, Marcus's story became more than just a moment at a party. It became a symbol, retold again and again. Churches spoke of him as an example of humility and perseverance. Motivational speakers cited his courage. Young musicians found hope in his journey. His story reminded people everywhere that greatness doesn't wear a uniform and genius doesn't carry a title. But Marcus never let the attention change him. He continued to live simply, to walk humbly, to carry himself with the same quiet dignity that had always defined him. Whenever people asked him about that night, he never spoke of fame or pride or revenge. He simply said, "I played the way. I always play with my heart." Years later, when people looked back on the night in the billionaire's ballroom, they didn't remember the champagne, or the gowns, or even the billionaire's arrogance. They remembered the janitor who silenced a room with music. They remembered the way he turned ridicule into reverence. They remembered the lesson his story carried, that true worth cannot be mocked, and true genius cannot be hidden. For Marcus, the piano was never about proving himself to others. It was about telling the truth of his soul. But in telling his truth, he gave the world a gift far greater than music. He gave them hope. He gave them faith in unseen potential. He gave them the reminder that no matter where you stand in life, no matter how others may judge you, your gift, your light can shine if you have the courage to let it. And so, Marcus's name lived on, not as the janitor or the mocked man, but as the man who played like a genius. The man who showed the world that respect is not given by wealth or status, but earned by the strength of the human spirit. That night in the ballroom became his legacy. Not because of the piano, not because of the billionaire, but because of the courage it took for Marcus to rise, to walk forward, and to play the first note. A note that changed everything. And though many years would pass, those who were there that night would never forget. They would tell their children, who would tell their children about the janitor who, with nothing but his hands and his heart, reminded the world what true genius really looks like.